they're going anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 feet, roughly a half a mile to a mile and a half, going horizontally. What happens is you go through the Marcellus Shale horizontally, and we heard the word fracking. They essentially set off a high pressure water full of sand and surfactants, like in soap, which breaks open the shale at this level and allows the gas to migrate into the pipeline. Essentially, the gas is stuck because if you think about a sponge, the old sandstone wells, they tend to be like an open sponge. You pick it up over your sink and the water runs out. Well, this sponge is like a closed cell sponge you might see in a mattress. It still obviously has a lot of air in it. You couldn't squeeze it, but you have to squeeze it to get the air out. And if you filled it with water and hold it up, a lot of times it'll stay heavy and the water won't come out. Well, if you bust it up some, put cracks in it or drill a lot of holes in it, the water would leak out. Essentially what fracking does is it busts up that closed cell and allows the water, or in this case the gas, to migrate because there's no pressure in the pipeline. It'll come out, the pressure will push it through. Essentially what we're looking at are drill patterns. There's a vertical well would have been put in here, and these are the horizontal wells that are drilled by the drilling companies. These are actual drilling patterns that were by one of the drilling companies here in Pennsylvania. If you draw little circles around these drilling patterns so they don't touch each other, each well has so far in Pennsylvania has averaged about 80 acres of drainage area. So that some of them may be 100 acres, some of them may be 60 acres, but on average each well has drained about 80 acres of area. So for every well they put in, they're retrieving the gas from between 40 to 120, call it 80 acres of area. A Marcellus well typically produces a lot of gas the first year and quickly dies off and then becomes a fairly steady producer, but at a low level on years thereafter, which means the well has got to pay for itself in the first year and a half. The investment to go into that well has got to be paid off pretty quickly, because after about a year and a half, it's just not going to make a lot of gas.
Isn't that why they would want the tax delayed?
Well, sure. Exactly. These wells typically produce between 3 and 6 billion cubic feet of gas over their lifetime. They produce roughly half of that in the first year or two, which means they, at $4 an MCF, they're probably worth between $3 and $5 million at a working interest. That's discounting this money, and I'll go over that in a couple minutes, back to the present. But they spend about $3 million to $3.5 million to drill a well. After their expenses, there's going to be a couple $1 million profit on each well, which is it's why you're in the business. That's over and above the royalty. That's the working interest. But that money is basically generated the first 2 years of operation in terms of paying back their investors and paying for their equipment and all the expenses in getting the well in. According to the Department of Energy, gas prices really bounced around a lot here, and I'm going to touch on that for a minute. Up to 2008, they've plummeted, and the Department of Energy sees them going above $5 and maybe making it to $7 by 2035. The reason the gas prices look to be stable in the future is because of the shale finds in the United States. There's a lot more gas than there was 3 or 4 years ago. There's a lot more gas marketable, available to be used than we thought it existed. That much gas tends to be an abundant supply, which tends to keep the prices down. So this gas has got to be able to be sold profitably in the less than $7 an MCF market. These are wellhead prices. On the way over here this morning, I checked. Wellhead prices in Pennsylvania as of May were roughly $4.40 a 1,000 cubic foot. City gate prices were roughly $6. That's the gas when it hits the wholesale market to sell into your house. At your house, it was $10 or less a 1,000 cubic feet, depending on who you might have been buying it from, what the transportation needs were, what the contracts, and so forth. So the wellhead price right now is about $4.50 a 1,000 cubic foot. Many of the documents produced by the drilling companies will tell you that at $4.50 a cubic foot, they can just about break even. So the gas they're drilling now, if they were selling that gas on the spot market, they would just about break even for the cost that they're putting in there. Most of the gas companies prefer to see the gas at $5, $6, and $7. Obviously, 1,000 cubic foot at the well, because that allows them to make a profit and have some wells go bad and accomplish some more risky or more expensive things to do. Right now, they're right on the edge of being profitable or not profitable on many of these wells. Some of them are making $4.50. Some of them are not making money at $4.50. Many of them are making money because they're selling into a market that they contracted back here in a futures market at $7 or $8 1,000 cubic foot. When the price hit that number, many of them pre-sold gas, which is typical in all industries of corn. Everybody else sells into the futures market, and that allowed some of the purchasers to hedge and allowed them to hedge. So there's a significant income still being generated in these. Regional activity. If you look at the number of drill rigs that are currently operating, and you look at if you take the drilling pattern, if we figure the number of rigs would double, we figure they could do 12 wells a year. There'll be 700 to 1,000 wells drilled in Pennsylvania this year. If you figure the average well spacing, that means 60,000 acres of Pennsylvania will be drilled and drained on any given year, which is roughly 1 to 2% of the available acreage. And what that says is it would take 50 years to complete doing the work at double the current rate of production until all of the Marcellus shale was accessed. That feeds into exactly what Dan was saying. This has a potential of being a fairly stable market. As we get through this immediate rush, we're looking at something that kind of grows at 2 or 3% a year for the next 50 years. And as they're growing, some of those old wells are declining and dying off. So there's always new ones coming on and always old ones dying off. Basically, they're drilling wells right now near pipelines. These are pipeline areas. And that makes sense. If I drill a well 50 miles from a pipeline, what good does it do me unless I lay a pipe or I build a factory on top of it? So the first wells to be drilled are where there are pipelines. There are properties here in Center County, for example, that have had a couple of wells put in them for Marcellus, and they're not operating right now because the gathering system in the pipeline hasn't been completed. When it's completed, they'll probably go in and finish the drilling, maybe put a couple more horizontal in there. Now, some interesting things, and I never believed in doing mineral properties by comp sales. But there's some interesting things happening in the Pennsylvania Marcellus shale market. First of all, there are two interests. Once a property is leased and drilled, there are two interests. The working interest, that owned and controlled by the operator, and the royalty interest, that owned and controlled by the landowner. But they don't have to be the landowner. They can just be a royalty owner at a certain point. But the working interest is the lessor, and that's the person who says, I've signed a lease, I'm allowed to get the gas out of the ground, I control that gas, it's mine to drill, move, sell, do anything I want to it. The royalty interest becomes the passive interest on this property. So the royalty interest in the old days was roughly 88%, 87% when we had 12% leases running around. Now we have 15, 18, 20% leases running around. So let's just call it the working interest is 80% of the gas, the royalty interest is 20% of the gas. You go back. Just a couple of points. April, Reliance Industry bought for $1.7 billion the equivalent of 120,000 acres, or $14,000 per acre for the working interest. There were no working wells. This was the undeveloped working interest of this property. February, Anadarko sold a 32.5% interest, or roughly 100,000 net acres, at $14,000 an acre to Mitsui. $14,000 an acre for the working interest, not the royalty, not the land, not anything but the working interest in the oil and gas underlying that property. May, BG Group takes 50% of Exco. which is here in Center County. They paid $2,900 per acre. For the working interest, there were shallow wells all over the property, virtually not making much gas. They bought them because it might allow them to drill deeper into the Marcellus without having to put the verticals in. Williams Company out of Texas bought from landowners and local people who put the deal together, not a major company, for roughly $12,000 per acre. Working interest. EQT purchased Marcellus Shale from other private investors in Cameron, Clearfield, Elk, and Jefferson County at $4,827 an acre. Again, working interest, not fee, not land, not houses, not pipes, but working interest. Typically in the industry, the working interest is everything that makes up the working gross income, which is the gross income minus the royalty. Typically throughout the industry, including Anadarko, Exxon, EQT, the major ones who are publicly held corporations that have to report their SEC documents, typically 47% of their gross income is their net operating income. In other words, it takes 53% of their gross income to drill the well, buy the equipment, and operate the well. So roughly it's a 50-50 split. If they're selling the gas for $4 an MCF, once they've paid everything off in that first 2 years, roughly $2 an MCF, 1,000 cubic feet, is net operating income. Now that's before taxes and other things like that, but it's the operating income that they tell their investors are traveling through the company. The other $2 is being spent to operate the well. Now, just a couple of quick things on terms of the appraisal. We've all heard the story that in the fee estate, we own from the moon to the stars in the sky to the center of the earth. And if I own the fee, I have the air rights, the surface rights, the mineral rights, I have everything else. If the airport is too close to me and they need to fly airplanes longer, they come and they buy my air rights. I've given that up. I get paid for it. They now own the air rights. They fly airplanes through it. Now, but you can split that up, just like I said, the air rights. You can sell an easement for a pipe, for a street, for this. You can do all kinds of things. You can sever minerals, and that's been done all over the state. In fact, a lot of the minerals in the state are not owned by the landowners at all. They're owned by other individuals. Some are owned by landowners that are now leased out. Some were never owned by the landowners in the last 100 years. A lot of the mineral estate in this state are owned by others underlying state game land, state parks and so forth, not owned by the state, owned by other individuals who in the 1890s or the 1870s sold off those mineral estates for cash to a company that may or may not have operated them. Many of the properties are controlled now by leases, which essentially transfers the ownership of the mineral estate. So what happens is once that gas comes out, there's a royalty interest that goes with the surface, but the gas estate is now owned by someone else. Skip that. I did that one. Now, one of the things that a lot of folks like to argue in Pennsylvania, and you won't find a law book that would agree with them, but they like to argue it, especially in Harrisburg, is that this leased gas, the tax bill, would go to the landowner anyway, and it would be a terrible imposition on the landowner. Unfortunately, that's not true. It wasn't true before 2002. It's not true now. The lease, according to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, is late as 1975, when it creates an exclusive right to remove oil and gas in the premises for 1 year, and as long thereafter as oil and gas found, it's a separate mineral estate was created. In 2002, the Supreme Court said, well, you can't tax it. They said the legislature never intended to allow gas assessment of oil and gas. They said counties were alone in taxing oil and gas interests. That's not true. They're taxed all over the United States. They said oil and gas interests were too intangible, fugacious,